That in the last 30 seconds of his statement, the chairman managed to talk about the subject of this hearing. But most of it was I think, somewhat inaccurate partisan attack on the general fiscal policy of the United States. And I remember a time when there were people on the conservative side who accused liberals of taking a blame America first strategy and saying everything was America's fault. Well, apparently that practice has switched sides, because we have a situation in which, as Mr. Bernanke said, and people sometimes forget that Ben Bernanke was the single most important economic appointee of President George W. Bush, first at the Council of Economic Advisors, then at the Federal Reserve. And Mr. Bernanke has agreed with President Obama that the European situation is one of the major threats to our being able to continue our recovery. And at a time when it is generally recognized by economic analysts that America did a better job of dealing with the crisis than Europe, and where America has been helpful in trying to get Europe to move, but where there were still serious problems, the chairman says, no, it's America's fault. That Europe should be apparently the example for us. Even though if you look at developed world economies today, America is performing far better than any of the European economies. The European economies are not doing nearly as well in economic growth as we are. But the chairman would rather make a partisan attack on the administration. When he does get to the international situation, it does seem to me he gets it very wrong. He does acknowledge that there is some impact from the European debt crisis, but he is somewhat critical of our efforts to deal with it, particularly the IMF. The notion that we should use our voting power on the International Monetary Fund to keep them from participating in a tripartite effort to deal with the European crisis is economic self-destruction. The fact is that the IMF is playing a very important role. It has been somewhat successful so far in helping. And a decision today that America was going to prevent any IMF participation in an effort to stabilize the financial situation in Europe would have a disastrous effect on the American economy. Now, a disastrous effect on the American economy would also have a negative effect on the president's chances for re-election. Perhaps that mitigates, in some people's minds, the negative economic effect. But the notion that we should try to block the IMF from constructive participation is economic mindlessness. And then, though, we did talk about the deficit. And again, the chairman seems to be oddly blaming America first when he contrasts the Europeans' view on debt and their actions to ours. Well, the Europeans have one great advantage with regard to trying to cut their debt. They have outsourced their defense to the United States taxpayer. If the European nations, our NATO allies, the EU members, were spending a percentage of their GDP comparable to ours, their debts would be far greater. And conversely, if we were to be able to reduce our GDP spending on defense to being only, maybe twice what the average European one is, we'd be making greater progress. The chairman quotes the president saying Medicare and Medicaid are the greatest drivers. I don't recall exactly what context the president said that, but I think that's wrong. I think that the excessive military spending, which in some cases has done more harm than good, such as in the war in Iraq, and which is increasingly, I think, showing to be futile in Afghanistan, but the United States taking over, as it has since World War II, the defense for Japan, the defense for Germany, the defense for other wealthy nations, that's a major factor. So to talk about the Europeans as models of how to deal with their debt and to denounce America for higher debt and ignore the fact that a major part of that is that we are carrying their defense, let's join in cutting it. And I would say on that, I am having a hard time reconciling my Republican colleagues' professions that it's important to cut the deficit and keep taxes the same with the decision to go into Syria, with the decision to get more military involved earlier in Iran, with the criticism of the president for talking about withdrawing from Afghanistan, for the criticism of the president getting out of Iraq. I do not understand how many of the Republicans who are critical of the president for not spending tens and perhaps hundreds of billions or more on the military over the next few years than he is predicting, reconcile that with the notion that we must cut the deficit. And now, like the chairman, I'll close by getting to the subject. We have a very important issue here. There is a debt crisis in Europe that is threatening America. We have the best performing of the developed world economies, but it's not doing good enough. One of the major threats to that would be a crisis in Europe. I support what the administration of the Federal Reserve have done to deal with that, and that includes support for the IMF.
The chair now recognizes